I'm excited to be joined today by David Bahnsen. And David, I'd love for you to give everybody just a quick summary of what's keeping you busy day to day. What have you been working on?
Well, I run a $10 billion wealth management firm called the Bahnsen Group, and the name of the company is not a coincidence. It is actually purposely named after me. So that does keep me plenty busy, and in my spare time, I am trying to do all I can to write and speak and promote the different things that I believe in. So never a dull moment.
Awesome. Well, David, there does seem to be a bit of a tension in the Christian world between work and like ministry and how to think about these categories, particularly when you're really wanting to leave a multi generational legacy for your family. So I'd love for you to maybe talk a little bit about where do you feel like the breakdown is, just like in the church theologically in this area when we think about work and how we approach it today.
Well, it's one of my favorite topics. I wrote a book that came out a couple years ago now called Full Time Work and the Meaning of Life, where I try to unpack a lot of these things. And I think you're right. The way you asked the question gets right to the heart of the matter. Is I do believe it's mostly a theological issue that if Christians believe that fundamentally there is a sort of superior realm of what they're doing that is spiritual and immaterial and ministry minded, and then this sort of inferior realm that is physical, material, and vocational, and that these two things are kind of separate from one another. It's understandable why we'd have a lower prioritization on that latter category and a higher prioritization on the other. But I think that that is a really severe theological error, a kind of Platonic view of the world, not a Christian view. And ultimately, it's what we refer to as dualism. That there's this distinction between the sacred and the secular. And I think that since the Reformation, a lot of us have been fighting for the idea that no, all of these things belong to God, or of equal importance. That He created the whole world, and that incarnationally Jesus coming as fully God and fully man reflects how much God cares about both the physical world and the spiritual world. And so avoiding that theological error of thinking one is superior to the other is very important. And then just really diving into what God created us to do. And time again, I come back to Genesis and why I believe as an image bearer of God, I am created to be a worker.
Yeah, it's not a part of the fall. Work pre-exists the fall. It's why we were created. I've heard people describe it as a Genesis 3 Christian versus a Genesis 1 Christian. Like,
Yeah.
do we start with the fall and then all of life is about recovering from sin, or do we start with creation and all of life was about doing this work, and this giant parentheses in the middle of our redemption is critical, but we can't diminish the fact that this was not like how would you pull apart those? Because there's a lot of tension there that you could just sit in Genesis 3 and say it's all about salvation. Give me theologically, how do you work through the role of what Genesis 1 says about our mandate to work?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, I'm a Genesis 1 and a Genesis 3 Christian. But what I would suggest is people that refer to the Genesis 3 thing, work being a curse, they're not totally consistent because they don't believe their children are a curse.
Hmm.
And yet, God said that work, the curse, work predated the fall. And then in the curse, it referred to the sweat of our brow and thorns and thistles. The first curse given to the woman was that there'd be pains of childbirth. No one's ever mistaken that for meaning that children were a curse. And so, in our Genesis 1 understanding, we know that two things predated the fall: family and work.
Hmm.
And in the curses, there's an impact to both family and work, which is the pains of childbirth and the sweat of our brow. And yet nothing there negated the creational normative of how important work is and how vital it is to our very purpose and identity. Being made in the image of God, Genesis 1:26 through 28, was defined in the context of God Himself being a worker.
Hmm.
Now, I fully acknowledge that sin tainted a lot of things, but this allows me to bring up another very important theological point is when you talk about the parentheses of, we go from creation to fall, redemption, and we believe there's this consummation at the end of history. But what is it God is redeeming? I believe that the grace restores nature. I think that the natural order was that God wanted us to be workers, to produce goods and services, to help finish that creation. He made an unfinished world, and yet the agent he made to go complete it was mankind. God loves us and wanted to be in communion with us. And so that Emmanuel principle now was disrupted by sin and is being restored by the redemptive work of Christ on the cross. We're living through this era of redemption. And for those who try to leave work out of that process, I think they're doing a big disservice to the theology of it.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. I love the fact that, okay, obviously family is not cursed. They're in the same bucket in the Genesis 1 and 2 bucket. And so we have to be consistent. That's really helpful. So part of what I would love for you to speak to as somebody who works with a lot of families that care about legacy. Obviously, when people get to a certain point of net worth, they start to say, okay, how can this be a blessing to our generations? And you come from a multi-generational family. Your dad was, apologist, and there's a legacy that you're living into. There's a legacy that you see. I'm curious how you think about this, because it seems like a very small percentage of Christian families are actually even aiming at a multi-generational legacy. How do you see that theologically?
You know, it's funny, maybe accidentally, but in the question itself, you've helped to really answer it because you're implying a definition of legacy that is far more biblical by mentioning my dad. I think you're right that my dad left me a legacy, and I just want to assure you it was not a financial one.
Yeah.
You know, he left me something I think was far more valuable. But when we refer to multi-generational legacy, it is so often kind of economic
Right.
language. And my father was a Christian intellectual who died in his 40s and wasn't in a position to leave me a material legacy, but he left me a significant spiritual and intellectual one that is of incredible importance in my life and in my purpose and in my being and identity. And I'm in a position now where I will be able to leave a material legacy for my children, but I'm not sure that I separate those things theologically. You know, I believe that we are to leave a legacy to our kids and our grandkids that's multi generational, that this is covenantal in the scriptures, and that those legacies are going to vary family by family, both and. There's sometimes going to be material blessings that need to be passed down and stewarded and cultivated. There should always universally be the teachings, the obedience, the faithfulness that is ongoing. But legacy needs to be defined holistically. And I think you were implying a more holistic definition of legacy.
Yeah, it'd be tremendous to have the legacy of a father who really stood for the faith the way your dad did. You mentioned there is a covenant between generations. I'd love for you to tease that out, because I think part of what I'm trying to understand theologically is and have been for the last like 30 years. I look in Jewish families and there's a lot of passion and clarity around the connection between generations that I don't see in Christian families. And as somebody who is theologically minded, like, do you see that as well? How do you diagnose that? What's going on there? Why is the Christian family so much less aware or interested in multi-generational legacy? Hey, it's Jeremy. When April and I started our family, we had love but no framework. Everyone was pulling in different directions. Then we discovered God's design for the household, a multi-generational team on mission. That changed everything: our rhythms, our purpose, even how we worked and rested. That's why we wrote a free course called 5 Days to Transform Your Family into a Team. It's 5 short emails with one simple step each day to help you realign your home to God's blueprint. You can sign up for free at familyteams.com/transform.
I think that that really is a newer phenomena in 20th century evangelicalism. And you're inviting me to wax and wane theologically, so I'll take you up on the
Yes.
invitation. But I think a lot of it is that we got away from a lot of our Reformed covenantal theology that was part of our post Reformation and into one that was a little bit more discontinuous. It was focused on individual salvation,
Mm.
soul saving, and as important as those elements of personal evangelism are, the Bible does deal in covenantal relationships. And when one becomes saved, how they pass this on to their children, that there is a multi-generational connectivity in the old covenant with Israel and the new covenant with the church. And I believe very strongly that the Bible has a framework that is covenantal and multi-generational, and that a heavy focus on individualism takes away from that.
Mm.
And the latter portion of the 20th century saw a more individualistic Christianity that unfortunately became latently non-covenantal, maybe not intentionally, but there was a latent a non-covenantalism. Yes, we are to pass on these blessings, this inheritance of the truth to our children and to their children, and raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and baptize them, and all those things that go with the Christian life. I think that you're going to have people that break covenant, they're disobedient to covenant, and you're going to have people that obey and people that struggle along with it. But taking seriously this notion that God deals with families is just a really, first of all, it's beautiful and a rich part of what we understand in Christian truth, but it also carries with it a lot of responsibility.
Yes. Well, I think for you, and one of the things I always love to drill into when anybody has connection with lots of families who are trying to figure this out, that have a lot at stake, making sure that these connections and this covenant stands because things are being passed on generationally. What have you learned from the families that are doing this really well? And are there any warning signs that you would say, "Hey guys, like if you think you're going to have a legacy, but you do, and you're doing these things, this isn't going to work so well." So what have you learned about this?
Well, some of them are so basic that it's almost unhelpful, except for the fact that they've become non-basic because unfortunately they're not table stakes anymore. I believe families should go to church together. I believe that kids should be raised to understand the scripture, whether it's with catechism or some formal training that helps them to just learn the ABCs of what the Bible teaches. That every family might find itself in a different situation, and there are different logistics around this, but I am a big advocate of Christian education, and I think it's hard to raise kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord and focus this covenantal message when, if they're learning about science or history or mathematics from a purposely atheistic or humanistic perspective, that the true, beautiful, and good matter in the ways kids view truth, the world, reality. So one thing my dad did very well was obviously expect us to obey. He taught us, how to behave, all of those kind of elements, but he did try his best to teach us how to think.
Mm.
And I think it's really hard for young people to hold the faith when they get off into the more competitive and challenging environment about doctrine and worldview in college and beyond. If they have to think like a Christian,
Mm.
some can persevere through it, but if you haven't been raised to think like a believer, it's very hard to stand up to the forces today that are fighting against you.
Mm. 100%. Well, last thing, David, I wanted to get your take on. Let's say, and we have a lot of families that have started businesses that are starting to see the very beginning stages of maybe a financial legacy that they could be preserving for their kids. That's obviously a very fragile moment for a lot of people. Okay, I've got some, and there's just a lot has been said about once you have maybe a major event and then you can easily dissipate, those resources very quickly. Any advice you would give to somebody, a family who's, let's say, they're starting to see some financial success, money is beginning to accumulate in a bank account somewhere. I want to leave a legacy to my kids financially. What have you learned from the families who do this really well? And any call outs that you would be, any warnings for families that are starting to see that happen?
Well, I think one thing that I would recommend people do is take seriously the doctrine of original sin. That we are in this stage on this side of glory that is post fall. And it's easy to take some things for granted. You feel like your kids have turned out well. But an early death, I mentioned my dad died in his 40s. I was only 20 years old. and he didn't have a material legacy per se, but imagine someone who's accumulated a good amount of money. Their child is 19 or 21, and they suffer a car accident or some awful unexpected fate. How many 21-year-olds that were raised right are ready in the maturity to receive that kind of money and steward it correctly? So having the guardrails in place where there might be money available under the oversight of a trustee, someone that the family respects and knows, they can make money available for medical emergencies or education or things like that, but not allow someone to go blow it. And you could say, well, my kid wouldn't blow it. They're really responsible. I have too much experience with this to tell you that it doesn't always work that way. And then the reality of original sin around spouses and partners and future things that come into the fray in the future, you want to set it up in a way that can protect it. And sometimes it's protecting people from themselves, and other times it's protecting people from others. I don't like any of this stuff, but I think it's a byproduct of a sinful world we need to take seriously. Then ultimately, obviously the best thing one can ever do, besides the guardrails and the legal language and the trustees and all those things, which are very important, but in addition to that, having people of good character that take stewardship seriously and having family conversations. Adult children, it's easier. It's tough to talk to an 11-year-old about maintaining the family legacy. But if you're in a position where your business is doing well and you've accumulated some shekels and the kids are into their 20s, talk to them about the family's value system, priorities, future legacy. Mine is more first generation wealth, and so I now have to think through it for the first time. Is it important to me that my kids receive inheritance and protected to their kids and their kids? This isn't something that my family's ever had to think about or worry about it. You can't take any of it for granted.
Mm.
So have transparency, have open conversation, and then model it. And that's another element. Modeling financial responsibility, modeling stability, where you both take it seriously, but you're not idolizing it. Living that out, the kids observe it, they see it, they hear the dinner time conversations, they hear the things that are talked about in the car, and they're more likely to honor it in their own adult lives if you've modeled it well for them.
Mm. Very good. Awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and for what you guys and your family just generationally has done for the kingdom and our country, and for so many others. So appreciate you taking the time and all that you guys are sowing into the future.
Thanks so much.